A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never considered myself a bad friend, but the day I snapped at Jenna, my pregnant best friend, turned my life upside down. It started innocently enough. Jenna was over for the fourth time that week, her foot swollen like a cantaloupe, her back aching from all the weight she was carrying, and to be fair, the complaints were unending. Each time she plopped down on the couch, it was like an exorcism of woes, the nausea, the cravings that went unfulfilled, and her desperate need for a foot rub. I could empathize. Pregnancy was undoubtedly hard, but each session felt like I was hearing the same horror story on repeat. By the time she showed up on that fateful Friday evening, I was exhausted from a week of late shifts and even later coffee. As she sank into her supportive pillows, I braced myself for another round of grievances, and that's when it happened. "I just want one day where I don't feel like a beached whale," she lamented, and something inside me snapped. It wasn't even the comment itself, but the way her eyes glazed over as she spoke, like she was on autopilot, repeating the same verses in a never-ending song of misery. I'd had it. I turned to her, feeling my chest tightening with frustration, and said, "Jenna, I can't stand your complaining anymore. You're pregnant, yes, but you have to find joy in this somewhere, right? I get that it's hard, but damn it, other people have it worse than you." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The laughter we had shared moments before died, her smile fading into a tight line, and silence enveloped the room like a cold blanket. I thought she'd laugh it off or throw a pillow at me, but instead, she just stared. Her reaction was haunting, her disappointment scalding, and for the first time, I sensed a dark shadow looming over our friendship. She muttered something that got lost in the tension before getting up and leaving, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing like a gunshot. At first, guilt gnawed at me. Had I been heartless? But then came ask you comfort, a whisper in my ear that maybe my words held some truth. The next day, a part of me expected her to text, to berate me or demand an apology, but nothing came. Days turned into a week, and I could feel the silence stretching like a taut string, almost ready to snap. When I did reach out, she'd answer but with the stiffness of a stranger. What hurt most were the glimpses of social media. I could see her struggles, the photos of swelling feet, cradling hands, but none of it felt real anymore. It was like watching a staged production where I had been written out of existence. Part of me felt relieved, thinking this space would allow her to regroup, but deep down, dread nagged at my core. Then, on a particularly lonely evening, just as I was about to drown myself in Netflix and Ben & Jerry's, a text from her lit my screen. "Can we talk?" My pulse quickened. I felt sick but also exhilarated. I agreed and mentally prepared for the storm. She arrived, and I noted the weariness etched on her face, shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," she started, voice wavering. "About what you said." Panic prickled my spine, but she continued. "I've tried to conceal my struggle because everyone tells me I should be joyful, I should be glowing, but I'm not. I'm drowning, and I thought you, of all people, would understand." I opened my mouth to apologize, realizing she wasn't just pleading for sympathy, but begging for a lifeline. I could see it now, all of it, the internal battle she fought, the guilt of not experiencing the serene bliss of motherhood while others sang its praises. But as I awkwardly fumbled with my words, it was clear all that came out was a mix of trembling apologies and half-hearted reassurances. I wanted to lift her burden, but the weight was too much for both of us, and just when I felt like we might connect, she dropped a bomb. "I had a dream about you, you know. Last night." Darkness washed over her expression, twisting reality into something grotesque, and my heart sank as she recounted a visceral dream of a shadow that had pulled her into a hall of crooked mirrors, and there, in every reflection, I stood, grinning, unfeeling, as she writhed beneath the surface. My skin prickled. "It felt so real, Jen. Like you were watching me suffer, and you didn't care." The moonlight pooled through her window as her voice softened. "You became the thing that haunted me." I tried to explain how I was just worn out too, but looked into her eyes and froze. I saw desperation, yes, but lurking beneath was something darker, something that felt like loss more than just disappointment. Then I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a weight in the air that made my breath catch. Something was coming. The power flickered then dimmed, leaving us awash in darkness, and I glanced around, heart racing as I felt it, a presence at the edge of the room, chilling and heavy, wrapping itself around our fears. "Jenna." I whispered, panic creeping back into my voice, but before I could even turn back to her, I felt an icy grip on my wrist. The last thing I saw before the shadows overwhelmed us was Jenna's eyes, wide and terrified, no longer filled with sorrow but pure dread, as she mouthed a word, "Help." It was in that moment, amidst a palpable darkness, I realized that my inadvertent cruelty had unleashed something far more menacing than either of us could comprehend, and as the darkness closed in, I understood, we weren't just fighting between us, we were wrestling with the very horrors we had conjured, each complaint, each thought twisting into the shadows waiting to consume us whole. I always thought that family gatherings were supposed to be joyful, filled with laughter and love, but for me, they were a reminder of the hollow ache in my heart, a wound that never seemed to heal. I had been married for 3 years, and despite countless doctor's appointments, hormones, and shattered hopes, I still hadn't been able to give my husband what his family craved, a grandchild. It's not that I didn't share their dream, I wanted a child as much as he did, but an insidious cloud of infertility hung over my head like a guillotine, waiting to drop at any moment. At every family dinner, the conversation would inevitably spiral toward the kids my sister-in-law was expecting or the cute stories of my husband's childhood that I had heard 1,000 times, both of which sent a fresh wave of salt water stinging my eyes that I would fight to keep at bay. As the chatter became more pronounced, I noticed the unmistakable glances my mother-in-law would cast my way, the pitying concern pooled in her eyes like the still water of a stagnant pond. I could feel her discomfort, her insistent attempts to engage me in discussions about fertility treatments under the guise of concern and support. I hated it. I hated the unwelcome attention on my most vulnerable secret, the nagging whispers that echoed through my mind. I wasn't just a woman, but a broken cog in her family's wheel. It all came to a head last Thanksgiving, the air thick with expectation as the aroma of roasted turkey drifted into my nostrils like a false promise. After we had feasted, my in-laws gathered in the living room, eyes glistening under the faded twinkle lights, chatting animatedly about future family plans. My heart raced as I sensed the shift in focus toward me, the moment when my mother-in-law cleared her throat, the precursor to her infamous "let's talk about the future" speech. "So, when do you think we might meet our grandchild?" she pried, her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor of underlying desperation. It was as if every pair of eyes turned to me with that question, the words swirling in the air like vultures, scavenging the carcass of my dreams. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and wanted to sink into the floor, to evaporate, but instead, with a jagged breath, I simply remained silent. My husband shot me a concerned glance, his father deflected with an awkward chuckle, but the damage was done. I felt raw, exposed, and utterly furious. Why should I have to discuss my deepest pain with people who only saw me as a vessel? That evening, as tension simmered beneath the surface, I retreated to the bathroom, clutching the cool porcelain sink, my heart racing as I battled the swirling storm of emotions. The shadows seemed to whisper, urging me to confront my in-laws about the delicate matter, to reveal the truth that felt more sacramental than flesh and blood. But all I could recall was a memory, the time I had briefly shared my struggles with close friends only to hear their casual insensitivity. "You can always adopt," was an unsolicited suggestion that had dug in like nails on a chalkboard. How could I trust anyone with this? Instead of expressing my frustrations, I turned my phone off and avoided them for the rest of the evening, feigning late-night work calls and bathroom breaks to escape their probing questions. When I returned to the living room, the chatter had shifted to other topics, my sister-in-law's baby shower planning, the grand plans summer would bring, all accompanied by the laughter and affection I had once thought unbreakable. I sat back down, feeling smaller than ever as my in-laws and husband conversed with ease, laughter cascading over me like a heavy wool blanket. I couldn't help but think that I had become a ghost in my own life, floating through moments that once filled me with joy but now only reminded me of the family I was struggling to provide. In the days that followed, our house grew quiet, almost painfully so. My husband, kind and patient, tried to forge conversations around my feelings, but all I felt was a wall robbing me of my voice. I became a coward, staring down the never-ending silence whenever my in-laws called or texted. Their messages turned from curious to frustrating, filled with concern that made my skin crawl. A week later, the family WhatsApp group ignited with photographs of my sister-in-law's ultrasound, and a tear slipped down my cheek as I muted the notification, each ping a dagger twisting into my heart. I felt like the villain of my own story, the one who refused to talk about the very thing that drained life from me. In my mind, I played a relentless cycle of what ifs. What if I talk to them? What if I shatter their dreams? What if I shatter my own? I could feel the weight of family traditions and expectations pressing down on me like I was being submerged underwater, gasping for breath and desperate for release. As the cold chill of winter set in, I avoided attending holiday celebrations, ducking out of every gathering, and insisting on working through the long weekends, all while my heart sank deeper into despair. Then came the shocking twist. One late night, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled upon a group dedicated to fertility issues, and suddenly, there it was, a thread that ripped the bandage off the wound I had tried to shield from the world. A woman, vulnerable and raw, told of her struggles and gave voice to the very pain I feared, and I felt it resonate within me like a forgotten song. As the comments poured in, each a testament to the shared struggle, it felt like a glimmer of hope. Until she casually mentioned, "Just remember to communicate with your loved ones, they can't help you if they don't know." Her words clung to the walls of my mind, pressing against the restraints I had put in place. That night, I finally broke down, tears flowing freely as I thought of my husband, the love we shared, and the family I had allowed to slip farther away. The next day, I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and initiated a text to my in-laws asking them to meet me for coffee. I had finally decided, it was time to talk. The moment my mother-in-law walked into the cafe, I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, only to be overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay beneath. We chatted about benign topics for a while, but the air was thick with unspoken words. As the steam from our drinks rose like ephemeral ghosts, I finally opened my mouth, feeling the weight of every word crash down around us like waves against the shore. I spoke of my struggles, the heartache, and the silence that had become my wall. They listened in silence, and in those moments, when the truth laid bare between us, I felt the temperature drop, an awkward pause settling like dust after a storm. To my surprise, after a few beats of silence, my mother-in-law reached across the table, her hand clutching mine, offering more than just sympathy, it was the promise of understanding. I finally began to heal, slowly but surely, yet the path wasn't easy. Some days, I faltered, the weight of expectations still looming over me, but I knew that mothering would come in many forms, perhaps not the expected route, but one that was uniquely mine. As time progressed, I became part of those family conversations, advocating for my own journey to expand our family, while embracing the unexpected joys that awaited us, understanding that familial love is resilient and can be found even in the spaces of discomfort and raw honesty. Sharing my story didn't only help my in-laws understand the pain I carried, it liberated me from its grip, transforming the way we could interact with one another. I wouldn't be the perfect daughter-in-law or the perfect mother, but I would be something far richer, an authentic member of a family that, in its messy, imperfect beauty, could truly embrace one another for who we are. Even after all the pain, I found myself craving those family gatherings, looking forward to laughter, to the inevitable questions, but also knowing that this time, I'd be able to talk about the dreams that had once felt so out of reach. So, AITA for refusing to talk to my in-laws? No, I realized, I was just human, and sometimes it takes a little courage to find the voice that lays dormant within. Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. "Fine," Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, "but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all." As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. "Good news, huh?" he chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. "I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what." My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. "Walter, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. "Why do you keep coming around?" The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. "Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around." The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. "You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him." My accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind, but by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. "Dad, you need to." Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. "You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here," he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. "Leave him alone," I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. "She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer," he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. "You don't need him, Dad. You have me. We'll do this together," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. "Dad," I began slowly, "we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered." The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. "Don't listen to her, old friend," Walter interjected smoothly, "she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we?" But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. "You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions." The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. "He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you," Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. "Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant?" But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. "You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name?" The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. "Dad, please, you need to believe me," I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, "If you love him, you'll let him go." Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you. My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. Enough, Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been. With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. Let's leave together, I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. You can't save him from the truth, Walter whispered, he will always be with me. No more. I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. No, we can build a future together. The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. It's him, isn't it? I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. He's coming back for us. The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. You're not going back there, I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach. When my grandmother passed away last month, grief wrapped around me tighter than the layers of fabric in my well-worn dark gray coat, the only one I'd ever needed for funerals. It didn't matter that it was the same coat I'd worn to bury my father just a few years before. I remember standing beside my mother at the dining table, her eyes swollen, reflecting a bleak mix of sorrow and irritation as she insisted that I needed a new black coat for the funeral because, in her words, black is the color of mourning, and your father would never forgive you for showing up in dark gray. I didn't understand why a different coat mattered so much when the sorrow it cloaked was the same, but she couldn't fathom that my attachment to that gray coat went beyond aesthetics. Desperate for my own space amidst the chaos of grief, I refused her demands, feeling my heart thud heavily as family discussions dwindled to whispered criticisms directed at me, portraying me as the ungrateful son who couldn't muster the decency to honor his deceased relatives appropriately. The societal pressure to wear a fresh coat became unbearable, and as I walked through the house that echoed with muted memories of family gatherings and laughter, I felt as though the essence of my loved ones lingered in the folds of that same coat, every crease a moment shared, every thread a lesson learned. On the night before the funeral, my mother barricaded herself in her room, and I found myself outside, staring at the growing shadows of the trees in our yard, their gnarled branches twisting like the pain inside me. I was losing everything dear, quickly engulfed by an anxious fog that choked my breaths, and yet, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to that old coat like a life buoy amidst rising tides of despair. Just as I resolved to wear what I felt connected to, I saw the weathered figure of my grandmother, her spectral form flickering in the moonlight, clutching the rope in her hands, just out of my reach. She whispered secrets of the past in the rustle of the leaves, and I felt something shift in my core, a reconciliation with her essence urging me onward. When I finally slipped that coat on, its lingering scent comforting and reminiscent of days gone by, I felt her approval envelop me, more potent than any new black fabric could offer. I may have failed to meet the expectations of a mother mourning her mother, but as I walked into the funeral home the next day, my chest expanded fiercely, fusing the layers of loss into one coherent resolve. However, it wasn't the weight of the coat that caught the attention of others, it was the hushed conversations around me, the scathing glares that sliced through the room and branded me as the odd son. My heart raced as I held my breath for the eulogies, seeking solace in the heartfelt sentiments shared by relatives, but when the speech turned toward traditional attire, my heart sank. I looked around to see the disapproving glances, relatives who I'd only ever seen dressed in black now aimed to paint my grief as colors beyond the spectrum of acceptance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the disdain and disappointment whispered behind my back echoed louder than the sorrowful words being uttered. No. I wouldn't let that coat overshadow the memories embodied in my actions. I held the fabric tight, its significance well known only to me and my grandmother, who had poured her soul into sewing all the buttons that clasped their spirit through intertwining threads of our family's legacy. Halfway through the eulogy, I stepped outside to collect my thoughts, greeted by the crisp bite of late autumn air, which felt like a bitter reprimand, punctuating that pervasive loneliness which seemed to chase me even in the company of family. My resolve wavered as the temptation to conform roared in my chest. I shuffled my feet, heart pounding as whispers about me drifted through the thin walls, shrouding me in a tempest of guilt. Did I really deserve to hold on to my memories, my grief, while causing a rift in my family? Just as doubt flooded my being, a rustling sound came from behind me, an old woman in a shabby old coat, much like mine. She didn't appear lost in sorrow but radiant in the brilliance of her past. I noticed the subtle but defiant sparkle in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered, "Tell me, dear boy, does a coat determine love? Does the ink of fabric hold the grave weight of grief, its fabric woven in time?" A second passed, and I felt the urge to spill my heart to this stranger, her presence igniting a warmth that made the chill of discontent fall away. "Be true to your love, dear heart," she continued, "that is the only thread that carries you through the veil." By the time I returned inside, I had shed the chains of my mother's expectations, ready to face the judging gasps with conviction. I reclaimed that gray coat, stigmata of love laced with mourning. It had become a monument, and I, in my unyielding stance against convention, finally understood that it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a testament to the bond shared with those we have buried in the earth, a visual legacy that would haunt the fabric of our lives forever. Yet, just when I believed my resolve would silence the whispers, something jolted me, something I couldn't explain. As I stood there, tears spilling down my cheeks, the air grew painfully thick. A chilling wail erupted from behind me, sending a shiver down my spine as the elderly lady's comforting presence began to dissolve into darkness, the echoes of her words transforming into a strange song filling the room. It was as if the shadows were hungry for the bonds we'd forged, ready to unravel every moment I had thought was sacred. My heart raced again, but this time, it was gripped in vice-like fear. What had I unleashed by clinging to my beloved gray coat? Suddenly, the cacophony of mourning morphed into laughter. Family members were grinning grotesquely, their faces stretching uncomfortably, eyes gleaming with desperation as if they desired to wrestle my coat from me, as if the very fabric prevented them from accessing the shared mourning we all needed to bury. As they moved toward me, engulfing my space with taunts of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had focused on me. The burden I carried had morphed into a sort of interloper that would not allow my family the catharsis they so demanded. I was slipping into a darkness that resonated deeply from the fabric, as though the memories that should have kept me rooted were becoming malicious, dragging me into depths of despair where coats had never mattered, but souls did. They were reaching for the coat, their laughter edging into madness, and I realized the family beneath the funeral garb had become ravenous specters, controlled by their hidden grief and impossible expectations. In that moment, grief twisted sinister, submerged in a deep well that churned beneath the fabric I clung to like a lifeline, and all I could do was turn and run, abandoning the whispers, the coiling darkness that craved to drag me into their ocean of shared torment, while my heart echoed with the ghosts of memory that tangled with the whispers of goodbye. Just when I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, I fell through the door, tumbling out into the cold world, only to see the reflection of that old woman, standing on the brink of the graveyard, beckoning me back as shadows flickered around my shivering frame. I screamed, not caring who heard me, trapped between guilt and love, whispers of family now reinforcing the doom that followed on the wind. Ida. I thought to myself, clutching at the dark gray coat that reflected my soul's turmoil, feeling time unfurl as the threads of my life became wisps of mourning, as fragile and relentless as the hatred swelling within. When my husband, Josh, died unexpectedly, a part of me shattered, twisting grief and disbelief into a bitter knot that settled heavy in my chest. We had only been married 5 years, but they had been the happiest years of my life. Josh was everything, my best friend, my partner, and the light in my life. Losing him felt like a slow suffocation, a waking nightmare that consumed me as I navigated funeral arrangements and the aftermath of his sudden passing. His mother, Elaine, had always been a complicated figure in our lives. She was supportive yet overbearing, and although Josh struggled with their relationship, I tried to foster peace between them. But after he was gone, that dynamic morphed into something else entirely. When I received the life insurance payout, a staggering 6-figure sum, Elaine immediately insisted that she needed half to cover the funeral costs she'd put on her credit card. I was taken aback. There was no discussion of her covering it or me paying her back later, just a demand as if her procession of grief gave her authority over my choices. I had expected tears, shared memories, and perhaps even a quiet moment where we could both remember Josh, but instead, a dark shadow hung over her eyes while she openly calculated her financial expectations. I remember being at the funeral, standing by his casket, the cool air heavy with an unspoken tension. Elaine had taken charge, orchestrating the details as if it were her final say in a business transaction rather than a memorial, and I can't help but wonder if this was her way of grasping control in a world spiraling out of our hands. With every interaction, her disappointment in me deepened. I wasn't mourning in the way she'd expected, perhaps because, beneath my sorrow, I felt the stirrings of anger that soon flared into resentment. When she demanded I give her money, something in me snapped. "It's not your money to demand, Elaine," I hissed, the words spilling out encased in bitterness. Her face turned ash white, an expression that danced between disbelief and outrage. I thought about the moments I shared with Josh, the joy we built together, and the memories we created as a couple. It felt wrong to surrender that to her. I finally decided to pay for the memorial and cover the remaining costs with the life insurance money, my own damn money, from a plan we had for our future, when I was now simply trying to navigate without him, in a world that felt cold and hollow. I figured it was my right to choose how to honor him, to be the one who decides where that money went, but that wasn't how Elaine saw it. Over the following weeks, she became more persuasive in her demands, trying to warp my sense of obligation by draping her words in grief. "You don't want to forget Josh, do you?" You want to honor him, she would say, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like a threat than kindness. I felt like I was being cornered in an emotional chess game, the pieces tipped in her favor. I watched her weave conversations filled with guilt while describing how hard it was raising Josh alone as a single parent, as if this somehow implied I owed her tribute for his very existence. I couldn't shake the feeling that her grief was more about her than about Joshua as I desperately sought the support of friends and family. Most didn't take my side, they echoed Elaine's logic, making me feel like a villain for wanting to claim what was rightfully mine, especially when they'd hear her sob stories. The nights that followed were filled with anxiety, guilt gnawing under my skin while I replayed those unbearable conversations. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own house, constantly haunted by my inability to bend to her will. One evening, as I was sorting through Josh's things, a muted ping from my phone snatched my attention. It was Elaine, with a photo of the blurred headstone at the cemetery, eerily illuminated by a waxing moon. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is where my only son sleeps, and you're the reason I have to suffer alone." I could feel the walls closing in around me, the pressure rising as I tried to breathe through waves of panic and regret. Who's the real monster here? I thought and countered my discomfort with a cold resentment. In that moment of blind rage, I decided to take a step farther. If she wanted to make this a game of emotional leverage, I would turn the tables. A few days later, as I watched her elaborate on her grief during family dinners to anyone who would listen, I gathered strength. I made plans to take a trip. I turned the life insurance into an opportunity. I booked a getaway to the mountains where Josh and I had always dreamed of spending a weekend, without a care in the world. It was a sanctuary for healing, and I was desperately clinging to memories of the man I loved. My phone buzzed frantically days before I was supposed to leave. It was Elaine, demanding to know where I was going. "It's none of your business," I retorted. Instead of caving under her barrage of guilt-laden messages, I dug deeper into my anger. I left, erasing the emotional strings Elaine had hoped to bind me with. The mountains embraced me like a lover, and there I found solace. I spent time reflecting on who Josh was, what he wanted, and how much he had fought to keep a distance from his chaotic family dynamics. A week passed in blissful isolation before I returned home to a barrage of voicemail and texts detailing accusations of theft, betrayal, and loss of family. I moved through my own fog of despair, waking nightmares that swirled in my mind as I listened. That's when it hit me. I was at the center of this conflict, one that would not fade away. It culminated one last terrible afternoon when I received a summons in the mailbox addressed in her meticulous handwriting, her betrayal now turned legal. The walls I had hoped to reinforce around my grief began to shake as dread seeped into every corner of my heart. I never intended to stop her from grieving, and I never wanted the insurance money to be the focal point of a battle for something as precious as memory. But looking back now, I recognize that Elaine didn't just want money, she wanted control over the narrative of her son's life, even in death. I am left to contend with the guilt that wraps around me like a shroud, yet, somewhere deep within, I know Josh would want me to find my own peace, and perhaps there's more to life than the pain of losing someone, especially someone who had to be let go, regardless of the bones they left behind. As I share this, I wonder, AITA for wanting to keep the money that was my lifeline to a man whose life I cherished more than anything? Perhaps it doesn't matter, not anymore. What matters now is confronting the echoes of a love that once lit my way and deciding how best to carry that light forward, alone. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loop smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What?" "It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. "Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you." The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? "You're making a big deal out of nothing, Eric," spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. "If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you?" I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized his dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one. Was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here, I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another. In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off, the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. I never thought I would reach the point where I had to cut my sister out of our weekly family dinners, but the moment she showed up with her son, Ethan, wearing a shirt that read "I don't care" and a scowl that could melt ice, I knew this was going to be different. Each week it had turned into a circus act, with Ethan running wild, climbing on furniture, and hollering about how everyone else was boring, while my sister, Lisa, just sat there scrolling through her phone, occasionally muttering half-hearted attempts to curb his antics. My parents would smile awkwardly, trying to ignore the chaos while I gritted my teeth, feeling every tentative attempt to make a meal or share a moment together slipping away like grains of sand. On one particularly disastrous evening, Ethan managed to grab a handful of mashed potatoes and fling them across the table, where they landed squarely in my dad's lap. Instead of mortification or an apology, Lisa just laughed it off, throwing her head back like this mess was some kind of comedy show. I snapped. "He needs boundaries, Lisa. You can't just let him act however he likes." Her laughter immediately turned into a glare as she shot back, "Really? Is that how you treat your kids? With such high expectations?" The accusation struck deep. I could feel my heart rate quicken, each beat echoing my growing frustration. So, after that night, or should I say debacle, I made a decision. I would stop inviting her until she could either parent her son or keep her opinions about how I raise my kids to herself. At first, it felt empowering, a way to reclaim my sanity, but then she began to retaliate, posting veiled messages on social media about the burden of judgment and family forgiveness. I felt a twinge of guilt each time I saw those whispers online, but my resolve was firm, like a wall against the tidal wave of her emotional blackmail. Weeks turned into months, and I convinced myself that I was the adult in the room, enforcing a boundary that had desperately needed reinforcing. But the longer I kept her at bay, the more I could feel something dark unraveling, like an uninvited guest finally revealing their true nature. I would wake up panicking some nights after dreaming of Ethan, screaming in a distorted version of my face, his laughter turning hollow as if he was mocking me for trying to carve out my sanctity. Then, one day, a message popped up on my phone. It was Lisa, a simple plea, "Can we talk? I miss you." I was caught off guard, my heart cautiously optimistic. Maybe she understood. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, the space buzzing with life, but the air between us felt suffocatingly thick. As she fidgeted with her cup, I braced myself, ready to hear her new understanding of parenthood or, at the very least, some acknowledgement of our strained relationship. Instead, she exploded, "You think you're better than me because you get to dictate who I can bring around? Ethan is my son, and he'll be how he wants to be, just like I will." I was taken aback by her intensity, like staring into a storm brewing on the horizon. My mind raced, thoughts tangled up as I fought the urge to defend myself. I'm not better, Lisa. I'm just trying to make sure our family dinners don't feel like a war zone. I need you to step up. Instead of a resolution, we only escalated, voices raised until people were glancing over, expressions of concern flickering across their faces. In that moment, it was like the earth beneath me split open, revealing something dark and twisted, years of resentment, envy, and a complete misunderstanding of what family meant. The coffee shop felt stifling, too warm, too bright, and when she abruptly stood, throwing her half-empty cup on the table and storming out, I felt like I had broken something precious and irreversible. Days turned into weeks, and the silence hung heavily in the air, permeating my every thought until even my kids began to notice my despondence. One night, while tucking my son into bed, I overheard them whispering about how Aunt Lisa didn't love us anymore. Their innocent whispers pricked me, forcing me to face the nature of my estrangement. It was a pattern, a wound we were both festering that seemed impossible to stitch back together. The turning point came in the form of a phone call. It was my mother on the other end, sounding distraught. "It's Lisa. She's not doing well," she breathed heavily. I felt my stomach churn, a deep pit forming as I heard the cracks of her voice. It turned out Ethan had been caught stealing from a store, and in a fit of despair, he had lashed out at his mom, claiming that she never cared. The lines continued to blur, the good, the bad, my choices, her choices, and the children caught in the crossfire. Later that same day, I stood outside their apartment, the familiar knocking on the door filled with a weight I wasn't sure I could lift. When Lisa finally opened up, her eyes were red, and her cheeks streaked with tears. I expected anger or confusion, perhaps even a breath of pride in her parenting. Instead, she crumpled at the sight of me, relentless anguish welling up in her gaze as she fell into my arms. "I'm failing, and I don't know how to fix this." Those words hung heavy in the air, laced in heartbreak and desperation. In that moment, I realized that we weren't just fighting over dinner invitations, we were wrestling with our fears and insecurities as parents. And as I held her, my heart began to soften. We began a long conversation that felt like a true reckoning. Those dinners we had both associated with chaos transformed into a healing ground, a space for vulnerability and support rather than the judgment we had projected onto one another. It took time, but soon enough, laughter replaced the tension, and while Ethan's antics didn't disappear entirely, resilience threaded its way back into our family fabric. I learned that sometimes, letting go of boundaries doesn't mean accepting chaos but inviting each other to grow and learn within that chaos, and maybe, just maybe, love would find its way back to our table one meal at a time.